All right, so get ready because today we're going deep on reverb, and you specifically wanted to kind of refine your approach to this. And the sources you shared have some really cool ideas about treating reverb not just as like an afterthought, but as this like foundational element in building a sonic environment.
Yeah, it is like a whole different way of thinking about it, isn't it? Both sources really challenge that traditional idea of just like slapping reverb on at the end.
Yeah.
They talk about it more like you're an architect, where you're like constructing a sonic space even before you like put instruments in it.
Okay, so I'm like picturing myself as this like audio architect now, blueprints in hand, but like how does that actually translate to mixing?
Okay, so think about it like this. Imagine like a classical music recording session. The engineers don't just choose like any old concert hall, right?
Right.
They very carefully select the space based on like its unique acoustics, like the size, the shape, the natural reverb.
Yeah.
That space actually becomes like a key part of the recording itself.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So instead of just like grabbing a random reverb plugin and like dialing in some settings, we need to be thinking about the overall sonic environment we want to create first.
Yeah, exactly. And here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Both sources suggest that you send all your tracks to a reverb bus at 0 decibels, like as a starting point. It's not about just drowning every single element in reverb.
Right.
The key is to then like pull back the send level on certain tracks,
Yeah.
especially the kick and bass.
So it's like giving those low-end elements some breathing room, like within the overall sonic space.
Exactly. You want them to subtly like acknowledge the space
Yeah.
without letting the reverb tails just like overwhelm the mix, you know?
Yeah.
The goal is to create this sense of depth, like perspective, almost like you're arranging instruments on a stage.
Right.
Some are closer, some are further away, and that affects how their sound reaches our ears.
So it's like that term in photography, depth of field, but applied to audio. I remember one of the sources using that analogy.
It's such a perfect way to visualize it.
Yeah.
In a photo that has like really good depth of field,
Mm-hmm.
some elements are like in sharp focus, while other stuff gently fades into the background. And in audio, we can actually get a similar effect by just like messing with the reverb sense.
So if I want a vocal to sound like up close and intimate, I'd use less reverb, and like a background vocal or a synth pad might have a longer, more spacious reverb to like push it further back.
Yeah, you got it. And just like photographers have all these different lenses to create different depth of field effects,
Right.
we can use different types of reverb to like create those different sonic environments.
Yeah, both sources mention some specific plugins like Lexicon, Valhalla Shimmer, and PhoenixVerb.
Yeah, and each of those has like its own unique character, you know.
Okay.
Lexicon reverbs are known for being like lush, almost like otherworldly, perfect for those like expansive ethereal soundscapes.
Yeah.
Valhalla Shimmer, as the name suggests, is great for adding shimmer and sparkle,
Right.
while PhoenixVerb is like praised for its clean, transparent reverb that just kind of like lends seamlessly into the mix.
But they also emphasize that it's not about having the most expensive plugins.
No.
Even stock plugins can get you amazing results if you just understand like the fundamentals of reverb and like how to use them creatively.
Absolutely. The technology is just a tool.
Right.
It's like the artistic vision, the understanding of how reverb shapes sound
Yeah.
that really matters.
It's like having a paintbrush versus knowing how to paint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to this point that really stuck with me.
Okay.
One of the sources, Pensado's Place, they said this great thing. They said, reverb is the feeling in the track. It's not just about making things sound wet or like adding an effect.
Right.
It's about creating an immersive experience,
Yeah.
a sense of space and atmosphere that actually evokes emotion.
So it's less about hearing the reverb itself and more about feeling its impact on the music.
Exactly. Think about it. When you walk into a cathedral, you don't consciously think, wow, there's a lot of reverb in here, right? You feel it. It envelops you. It adds this sense of grandeur and awe. That's the kind of feeling we're trying to get with reverb in our mixes.
And one source talked about good reverb as creating this sense of suspended sounds where like the elements feel like they're just effortlessly floating within that space.
Oh, yeah. It's a beautiful analogy, isn't it?
Yeah.
It highlights how reverb can tie everything together, creating a cohesive sonic environment where each element has like its place and contributes to the overall feeling.
So we've got this idea of building a sonic environment, using reverb to create depth and perspective, and evoking a feeling rather than just an effect.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here? How do we actually start putting these ideas into practice?
Well, there's some really cool techniques for fine-tuning that reverb balance, shaping its character, and using it in clever ways to enhance the emotional impact of your mix.
So it's about finding that balance between acknowledging the room, but like maintaining clarity. And this
Well,
ties back into that depth of field analogy, right?
absolutely. We can use reverb to create a sense of perspective,
Right.
just like a photographer uses depth of field to like draw your eye to certain elements in a photo.
So elements with less reverb feel closer, and then the ones with more reverb feel further away. It's like we're creating this three-dimensional audio image.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of like the most powerful techniques for creating depth and complexity,
Okay.
layering reverbs.
Yeah, both sources recommend starting with a primary room reverb to like establish the foundation and then adding a secondary larger space reverb for like additional depth. But I'm curious, how do you actually like choose the right reverbs for each layer?
Well, for that primary reverb, you'd want something that like matches the overall vibe of the track.
Okay.
If it's a warm, intimate song, you might choose a plate reverb, known for its smooth, lush decay.
Yeah.
But if it's more like epic, anthemic, you might go for a hall reverb with its like huge, expansive character.
And then the secondary reverb would be chosen to like complement or contrast with that primary one.
Exactly. You could use a totally different type of reverb or even the same type, but with different settings to create a subtle variation.
Okay.
And remember those specialty reverbs like Valhalla Shimmer?
Yeah.
Those are great for adding like a really unique texture and ethereal quality to specific elements.
Okay, so we've got our primary and secondary reverbs creating this like sense of depth and perspective. Is there anything else we can do to like enhance that sonic environment?
Well, one source got into this really interesting aspect of reverb. They explain how adjusting the stereo width of your reverbs can actually make things sound closer or further away.
Oh, that's cool. I never really thought about stereo width in that context. How does that actually work?
Well, our brains interpret narrower stereo images as being further away,
Okay.
just like how objects appear smaller and less detailed as they get further away.
Right.
So you could use a wider stereo reverb on a lead vocal to make it feel front and center, and then a narrower reverb on backing vocals or instruments to push them back in the mix.
It's like we're using stereo width as another tool to like sculpt that sonic landscape.
Exactly.
This is really starting to paint a picture of how we can create a truly immersive and multidimensional experience. But with all these layers and adjustments, how do we keep things from getting like muddy or overwhelming?
That's where EQ comes in.
Right.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. Both sources really stress the importance of not just EQing the tracks going to the reverb, but EQing the reverb itself.
So it's not just about shaping the sound of each instrument, but
Yeah.
shaping the sound of the actual space itself.
Exactly. By gently rolling off the highs and the lows of the reverb.
Okay.
You can clean up that low-end mud and keep the reverb from clashing with other stuff in the mix.
It's like we're fine-tuning the acoustic properties of that virtual space we've created.
Exactly. And one source brought up this really helpful concept when you're listening to your reverb.
Okay.
They called it suspended sounds.
Yeah, I love that idea. It like evokes this image of the sounds just floating effortlessly in the space.
Right. When you get that sense of suspension, it means the reverb is working with the music, not against it.
Right.
It's creating this seamless blend where everything just feels like it belongs, effortlessly floating within that sonic environment.
So we've got layering, we've got depth of field, we've got stereo width manipulation, and we've got EQing the reverb itself. It seems like there's a lot to think about when it comes to reverb.
It can feel overwhelming at first, but it's like a journey of exploration,
Right.
experimentation.
And ultimately, it's about trusting your ears and your instincts to create a sonic environment that really serves the music and evokes the emotions you want.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so we've like laid down all this theoretical stuff about like crafting these immersive sonic environments with reverb, but I'm like really eager to hear how these concepts actually like work in real mixing situations.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Can you like walk us through some practical examples of like how we might approach reverb on different elements in a mix?
Absolutely. Let's start with like something familiar, like vocals.
Okay.
Imagine you have this really powerful lead vocal that you want to just like really shine,
Yeah.
feel up close and personal, almost like the singer is right there in the room with the listener.
Okay, so we're going for that intimacy and presence. I'm thinking maybe a plate reverb would be a good choice here.
You're on the right track.
Yeah.
Plate reverbs with that like smooth, lush decay are perfect for creating that closeness.
Okay.
And to really make it feel like the vocal is front and center, we want to keep the stereo width pretty wide.
So we've got our lead vocal sounding nice and warm and intimate with that plate reverb. Now, let's say we have some backing vocals that we want to like blend in nicely, but also create a sense of depth, like behind the lead.
Okay.
How would we approach the reverb on those?
This is where that layering stuff comes in.
Okay.
We could use a completely different type of reverb on the backing vocals
Right.
to create a distinct contrast with the lead.
Okay.
A hall reverb, for example,
Yeah.
would add that sense of air and expansiveness, pushing those backing vocals further back in the mix.
And to like enhance that depth even more, we could narrow the stereo width on that hall reverb.
Exactly. So by just playing with both the type of reverb and that stereo width,
Yeah.
we can really make those backing vocals sound like they're floating behind the lead.
Okay, so we've got this nice vocal arrangement taking shape.
Mhm.
But what about like instrumental elements?
Yeah.
Let's say we have a delicate piano melody that we want to feel like almost ethereal, like it's suspended in midair.
I see you're reaching for those specialty reverbs.
I am.
You mentioned Valhalla Shimmer earlier.
Yeah.
I think that would be perfect here.
Yeah. Valhalla Shimmer is known for creating those like really otherworldly, shimmery textures. I can already hear it.
You could dial in like a long decay time and some subtle modulation to really get that ethereal quality.
Yeah.
And you could even automate the send level throughout the song
Oh, okay.
to create some movement and dynamics.
So now we have all these different elements,
Mhm.
each one kind of occupying its own space in the mix thanks to our use of reverb.
Yeah,
But how do we make sure that everything gels together, you know?
that's where EQ is like super important.
Right.
And remember, we're not just EQing the tracks, we're EQing those reverbs too.
Yeah. Right. It's like we're fine-tuning the acoustic properties of that virtual space.
Exactly. By just gently rolling off the highs and lows of the reverb.
Okay.
You can avoid that muddiness and make sure that each element sits clearly in its own space,
Yeah.
contributing to that whole sonic picture without clashing with the others.
This whole process feels like this delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
Like we're sculpting the sound with like precision and artistry.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And remember that concept of suspended sounds?
Oh, yeah.
When you get that right, it means that the reverb is working with the music, not against it.
Yeah.
It's creating that seamless blend where every element just feels like it belongs, effortlessly floating within that sonic environment.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
This has been like a really eye-opening deep dive into reverb. It's made me realize that it's so much more than just an effect.
Yeah.
It's like a tool for creating immersion, depth, emotion, and a really captivating listening experience.
And as we wrap up, I want to encourage you to not just like take in this info, but to really go out and apply it.
Yeah.
Experiment with these techniques in your own mixes.
Yeah.
Push the boundaries of what you thought was possible with reverb.
And most importantly, listen closely to the reverb in your favorite songs.
Yeah.
Pay attention to how different artists and producers use this powerful tool to shape their music.
Because once you start thinking about reverb, not as just an effect,
Yeah.
but as like an essential part of the sonic architecture,
Yeah.
you'll unlock a whole new level of creativity and depth in your own mixes.